The final click of the apartment door echoed in the barren, echoing hallway, a sound as definitive and cold as a judge's gavel striking wood. It was done. Leo stood on the cracked pavement, the city's indifferent and roaring hum a stark contrast to the screaming silence in his own head. A biting, cruel wind whipped around the corner, carrying the acrid scent of bus exhaust and the sweet, sickly smell of damp garbage from an overflowing bin. He felt a deep shiver that had nothing to do with the falling temperature. It was the cold touch of absolute dread. His bad leg throbbed with a dull, hateful pulse that traveled from his hip all the way down to his ankle, a constant, gnawing reminder of the day his life, his body, and his future had splintered into a million pieces. He gripped the plastic handle of a single battered suitcase, its wheels broken, that held every last thing they owned in the world. Beside him, his 8-year-old daughter, Maya, clutched the straps of her small pink backpack, her knuckles a stark white. He could feel the crumpled eviction notice in his pocket, its sharp paper edges digging into his thigh like a tiny, insistent knife. He felt his stomach clench violently, a knot of pure, unadulterated terror of the void that had just opened up right beneath their feet. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to move, to do something, but his feet felt bolted to the concrete. He was a statue of failure for the whole world to see. His hand trembled uncontrollably as he pulled his worn leather wallet from his back pocket, the simple action feeling monumental. The leather was cracked and soft as cloth, a ghost of the proud young man who had bought it with his very first construction paycheck. He opened it under the sickly orange glow of a flickering streetlight. One by one, he counted the bills, his calloused, thick fingers clumsy with a rising tide of anxiety. The final tally was a quiet, brutal death sentence. $1,483.22. That was it. The sum total of his life, the pathetic paper-thin barrier standing between his daughter and the city's unforgiving streets. His disability checks, once a meager lifeline, were now a cruel joke, swallowed whole by rent and utilities until absolutely nothing remained. He felt a wave of hot nausea as a memory flashed behind his eyes. The deafening scream of twisting metal, the blinding white pain, the sudden shocking realization that he would never climb a scaffold again. This money had to last. It had to perform a genuine miracle, but he could already feel it slipping through his fingers like fine, dry sand. Each dollar a grain of time running out for him and for Maya. The pressure was a physical weight on his chest, a crushing anvil that made each breath a shallow, ragged, and useless effort. He was drowning in the open air. "Daddy, are we going on an adventure?" The question, spoken in a small and impossibly hopeful voice, sliced right through the heavy silence between them. Maya looked up at him, her wide brown eyes reflecting the blurry city lights, her complete and utter innocence a painful spotlight on his own devastating failure. She didn't understand eviction. Not really. She just knew they couldn't go back to their room, her bed, her small collection of crayon drawings taped lovingly to the wall. To her, this was just a strange, late night with her father, an unexpected deviation from the routine. He felt a dagger of pure guilt twist deep in his gut, sharp and merciless. How could he possibly answer her? He forced a smile onto his face that felt brittle, like cracking plaster. The lie was a bitter, metallic taste on his tongue. Something like that, sweetie. A brand new adventure. The real fear, the one he couldn't even speak aloud, began to coil in his stomach like a cold snake. It wasn't just the looming cold or the gnawing hunger. It was the sterile office of social services, the pitying looks of strangers in suits, the quiet rustle of paperwork that would declare him an unfit parent. The thought of them taking Maya away. It was a cold, seeping dread that penetrated deeper than any winter wind, freezing the very marrow in his bones. A violent tremor ran through his hand, and he quickly hid it in his pocket, deeply ashamed. The throbbing in his leg was no longer a dull ache. It was a loud, screaming protest with every limping step he took. It was a constant, mocking companion, the physical manifestation of his complete uselessness. They had been walking for over an hour, aimlessly drifting through a labyrinth of concrete and indifferent streetlights, each one seeming to mock his poverty. He scanned the grim facades of the buildings, desperately looking for a sign for a cheap motel, a place they could hide for just one night. But every glowing vacancy sign felt like an accusation, screaming of money he couldn't afford to spend. The rich, savory smell of food wafted from a street vendor's cart, sizzling sausages. The sweet aroma of fried onions, and his stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak, settling over his shoulders, making his eyelids feel like lead weights. He felt hollowed out, a fragile shell of the man he once was. The strong, capable construction worker who could lift steel beams was utterly gone. In his place was this broken, limping wreck who couldn't even keep a roof over his own child's head. Hot, shameful tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, and he blinked them away furiously before Maya could ever see. He found a splintered wooden bench inside a cavernous, near-empty bus station and gently sat Maya down. Within minutes, she was fast asleep, her head lolling onto his lap, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Her face, so serene and innocent in slumber, was a silent, devastating accusation. He had promised her a safe world. He had promised her a happy life, full of warmth and laughter, not cold benches and the sharp, chemical smell of disinfectant. It was a sacred promise he had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He gently shrugged off his own thin jacket and draped it over her small, shivering body, the worn fabric smelling faintly of old sawdust and his own quiet despair. The silence in the station was a living thing, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant, mournful wail of a police siren cutting through the night. He felt his heart tighten into a painful, solid knot in his chest. To her, he was a hero, a giant, her sole protector, and he was failing her on every conceivable level. The feeling of utter worthlessness washed over him, a cold, suffocating tide that threatened to pull him under for good. He had one last desperate idea, a terrifying, insane gamble he'd found online, a long shot in the dark. But it was the only plan he had left. It was all that stood between his sleeping daughter and the coming abyss. Under the sickly orange glow of the bus station's fluorescent lights, Leo's thumb hovered over the glowing screen of his cheap, cracked smartphone. The battery was at 12%. His heart pounded a frantic, unsteady rhythm against his ribs. He was looking at a bookmarked real estate listing, a collection of slightly blurry, artfully angled photos of a house. "Fixer-upper with potential," the description read. The words were a lifeline and a lie, and he knew it. But the price, a rock-bottom figure just within the realm of his catastrophic finances, was an irresistible siren song for a drowning man. He felt the sick, churning knot of anxiety in his stomach as his finger trembled. This was insane. It was a desperate, last-ditch gamble with his daughter's entire future. With a final, ragged breath, he tapped Confirm Purchase. The small confirmation checkmark that appeared on the screen felt as loud and final as a gunshot in the silent, cavernous station. He had just set their new, terrifying course. The bus ride was a long, shuddering journey into the unknown. Leo felt the constant, droning vibration of the engine in his bones, a monotonous hum that seemed to be shaking loose the last of his composure. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap, vinyl seats that were sticky to the touch. Maya, who had started the trip with a forced, fragile excitement about their adventure, had fallen quiet. Her small face was pressed against the cold, grimy glass of the window, her breath fogging the pain as she watched the familiar city skyline shrink, then dissolve into an unfamiliar, sprawling suburbia. With every mile that clicked by on the highway, Leo felt the knot of dread in his gut pull tighter. He tried to recite a mantra in his head. This is a new start, a brave choice. But the words were hollow, tasting like ash and fear in his mouth. His bad leg began to ache with a familiar throbbing rhythm, a painful metronome counting down to the moment his desperate gamble would be judged. The main bus line terminated in a small, forgotten town, and from there, the journey fractured into something more desolate. They boarded a smaller, rustier shuttle that smelled powerfully of diesel fumes and dampness. That shuttle took them to a single, lonely crossroads where a sputtering taxi, its body the color of dried blood, was waiting. The driver was a gaunt, silent man who never met Leo's eyes. the air in the cab thick with the scent of stale tobacco and something vaguely sour. The last of the paved roads quickly gave way to poorly maintained gravel, which in turn dissolved into a deeply rutted, muddy track that seemed to be clawing its way into the wilderness. The world outside the rattling windows became a monotonous, depressing sea of brown, dormant fields and skeletal trees reaching for a pale, washed-out sky. Leo felt the isolation seep into the car, a cold, oppressive presence. He wasn't just leaving the city. He felt as if he were being driven off the edge of the known world. The taxi lurched to a final, jarring stop, kicking up a cloud of brown dust. "This is it," the driver grunted, his first words of the entire trip. He gestured with a nicotine-stained finger toward a dark, amorphous shape, barely visible through a riot of tangled, overgrown bushes and dead weeds. The transaction was a grim, silent affair. Leo handed over a significant portion of his remaining cash, the crisp bills feeling like a payment to his own ferryman, delivering him to the shores of Hades. The taxi turned around with a groan of its suspension and rumbled back down the dirt track, its engine noise fading until it was swallowed completely by an immense, profound silence. It was a silence unlike the quiet of the city. It was heavy, dead, and absolute. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and rot, felt physically heavy in Leo's lungs. A cold, sharp spike of undiluted panic shot through his chest. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. He gripped Maya's hand, his own slick with a cold sweat, and pushed through a broken wooden gate, its one remaining hinge screaming in protest like a tortured animal. And then he saw it. The photograph online had been a masterpiece of deception, a cruel and calculated lie. This wasn't a house. It was a carcass. A skeletal ruin picked clean by years of neglect and harsh weather. The porch didn't just sag. A huge, jagged section had completely collapsed inward, leaving a gaping black maw that seemed to lead straight into the earth. The roof was a disaster, a concave patchwork of missing shingles and splintered grey wood with a dangerous dip in the center that looked like a broken spine. He could see patches of the bleak, empty sky right through it. And the windows, every single one was shattered, not just cracked, but completely gone, leaving empty black sockets that stared out blindly, giving the structure the horrifying appearance of a skull. Leo felt his breath catch in his throat, a strangled, hopeless gasp. As he took another hesitant step forward, a smell, potent and foul, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. It was a thick, suffocating stench that went far beyond simple dampness. It was the deep, pervasive odor of rot that had sunk into the very bones of the building, the smell of years of stagnant water, of mildewed plaster, and the faint, distinctly putrid scent of small, dead things decaying within the walls. The wind, which had been a mere urban annoyance, was a different beast here. It howled through the empty window frames with a low, mournful whistle, a desolate sound that made the entire structure groan and creak like a great, dying animal. It was the sound of absolute abandonment. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, the sensory assault so overwhelming that he had to reach out and steady himself on a nearby fence post. His hand came away slick with a disgusting, cold layer of green slime. The reality was a waking nightmare. "Daddy, it's broken." The voice was a tiny, trembling whisper that barely carried on the wind. It was Maya. He looked down and saw her small face, which had been filled with a tired curiosity, now pale and pinched with a dawning fear. She was no longer holding his hand, but hiding behind his bad leg, peering out at the monstrous wreck as if it were a beast from a fairy tale. In her wide eyes, he saw the fragile trust she had in him beginning to fracture and crumble. He had promised her an adventure, and he had led her to this derelict horror. The guilt was a white-hot poker, searing his insides. He felt the familiar, shameful sting of tears at the corners of his eyes, but forced them back. His jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. He had to be strong for her, had to project a confidence he didn't feel, but inside, he was a hollow, brittle shell on the verge of shattering completely. This wasn't a fixer-upper. The thought landed in his mind with the cold, heavy finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. This was a tomb, a death trap, He was a construction worker, yes, but a disabled one. He had no money, no tools, no electricity, and as he scanned the desolate horizon, no neighbors to call for help. The sagging roof looked like a breath of wind could bring it crashing down. The collapsed porch was a pitfall waiting for a misplaced step in the dark. The shattered windows offered zero protection from the biting wind, the coming rain, or whatever creatures might be lurking in the oppressive darkness of the surrounding woods. He had spent every last dollar he had in the world to trap himself and his daughter in a place more dangerous than the streets they had fled. The full, crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake descended upon him, and he felt his knees physically weaken, the throbbing in his leg flaring into a roaring fire of pain and self-loathing. He had to get them out of the wind, pushing open the front door, which hung crookedly from a single, groaning hinge, felt like unsealing a crypt. The gloom inside was somehow colder and damper than the air outside. A thick, grey blanket of dust and grime coated every surface, disturbed only by the delicate, spidery tracks of mice and other unseen things. Great chunks of plaster had crumbled from the walls, littering the warped floorboards in pale, ghostly piles. Cobwebs as thick as cotton candy hung from the ceilings in heavy, drooping shrouds, swaying gently in the drafts. The air was stale and heavy, catching in the back of his throat and making him cough. He could hear a constant, maddening symphony of decay, the frantic skittering of something small and fast in the walls, and the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water leaking from the ruined roof onto the floor in the next room. Any lingering ember of hope he'd been nursing was instantly, brutally extinguished. He limped numbly from one decaying room to the next, each one a new tableau of desolation. Peering out of a shattered back window, he saw nothing but an endless, unbroken expanse of tangled, thorny woods and pale, dying grass that stretched all the way to a horizon that felt 1,000,000 miles away. The profound, terrifying isolation of the place began to sink into his very bones. They were utterly, completely alone out here. If Maya were to get sick, if his bad leg gave out and he fell, if anything at all were to happen, no one would hear them scream. No one would even know they were here to be found. The chilling realization crawled up his spine like a cold insect and settled at the base of his skull, a permanent knot of fear. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had navigated them to the very edge of the world and carelessly stepped off into the void, taking his precious daughter down with him into the crushing, silent emptiness. Night fell with a frightening swiftness, and the darkness that filled the ruin was absolute. A thick, palpable black ink that swallowed all light and all hope. The temperature plummeted. A damp, penetrating chill began to seep up from the floorboards, biting through their thin jackets and jeans. Using his own coat as a makeshift broom, Leo swept a small patch of floor clean of the worst of the filth and debris in a corner of what he guessed was the main room. They huddled together for warmth, their backs pressed against a damp, crumbling wall that felt as cold as a tombstone. He could feel Maya trembling in his arms, a constant, shivering tremor that was born of both cold and fear. He tried to hum a lullaby, one he used to sing to her when she was a baby, but his throat was tight with unshed tears and despair, and the sound came out as a choked, pathetic croak that was quickly lost in the groaning of the house. Lying there in the oppressive, suffocating dark, with his daughter shivering in his arms and the sound of mice skittering in the walls, Leo finally understood the meaning of rock bottom. This was so much worse than being evicted. It was worse than the cold, impersonal bench in the bus station. In the city, for all its dangers, there was at least the distant possibility of help, the simple ambient presence of other human beings. Here, there was nothing, just the vast, indifferent emptiness and this rotting structure that he had, in his foolishness, condemned them to. The self-loathing was a bitter acid churning in his gut. The constant, nagging pain in his leg was a dull, distant echo compared to the screaming agony in his soul. He felt his spirit finally break. All the fight, all the desperate energy that had propelled him this far, simply drained out of him, replaced by a cold, heavy resignation. He closed his eyes and wished he could just dissolve into the darkness and cease to exist. The words from the online advertisement began to play in his head on a torturous loop, each phrase a fresh stab of mockery from a phantom salesman. Fixer-upper with potential. a rustic country retreat. Your chance to escape the hustle and bustle. It was all a lie. A carefully constructed fantasy sold to the most desperate and foolish of men. He replayed the moment he had tapped confirm purchase on his phone, the insane, reckless surge of hope he had allowed himself to feel for a fleeting second. How could he have been so stupid, so willfully blind? The photos, he realized with a sickening clarity now, must have been a decade old, taken on a sunny day, from very specific angles, bathed in a warm, forgiving light designed to hide every flaw. A brief, useless flare of impotent rage burned in his chest, directed at the faceless entity that had sold him this ruin. But the anger fizzled out as quickly as it came, leaving only the cold, heavy ash of his own culpability. The physical toll of the last 48 hours was catching up to him with a vengeance. A dull, aching hunger gnawed at his insides, a constant, unpleasant companion to the relentless throbbing in his leg. His body felt like a machine that had been run far past empty, and every small movement required a monumental effort. The deep, penetrating dampness of the house was seeping into his bones, making his joints ache with a cold fire. He felt a dry, rattling cough building in his chest, a worrying sign of the dust and mold spores he was breathing in. A fresh wave of panic washed over him as he thought of Maya. Her small body wasn't built for this kind of hardship. He pressed his hand to her forehead in the dark, a desperate, fearful check. She felt cool for now. But for how long? How long could they last in these conditions before one of them got seriously ill? This house wasn't just a symbol of his failure, it was an active and immediate threat to their lives. In the deepest, darkest hour before what he could only assume would be a miserable grey dawn, Leo did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He prayed. It wasn't a formal, eloquent prayer learned in a church. It was a silent, desperate scream sent out from his soul into the crushing, indifferent void. Help us. Please. I made a terrible mistake. Please don't let her suffer for it. Don't let my daughter pay the price for my failure. The tears he had fought so hard to contain finally broke free, tracing silent, hot paths through the grime on his cheeks. He pulled Maya even tighter against his chest, burying his face in her hair, which still smelled faintly of the city they had left behind, a scent from another lifetime. He felt completely and utterly broken, a man at the absolute end of his rope, trapped in a waking nightmare of his own making, with no hope and no way out. The house groaned around them one last time, a final, funereal sigh in the endless dark. A pale grey light began to seep through the newly paned windows, a weak and watery dawn that did little to warm the bone-deep chill in the room. Leo awoke with a groan, every muscle in his body stiff and aching, a symphony of protest against the hard, dusty floorboards. The pain in his leg was a dull, constant throb, a familiar and unwelcome companion. He felt the crushing weight of the previous day's failure settle back onto his shoulders like a physical shroud. He was a fool, a broken man who had led his daughter to a tomb. He could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of Maya's breathing beside him, and the guilt twisted in his gut like a knife. He had failed her so completely. He lay there for a long moment, listening to the groaning of the house, mustering the energy to face another day of this living nightmare, a day that promised only more cold, more hunger, and more despair. The air felt heavy and dead, thick with the smell of rot and his own suffocating hopelessness. It took a monumental effort to just sit up. But as he did, something felt different. He couldn't place it at first. It was a subtle absence. He tilted his head, listening. The mournful, whistling howl of the wind that had been their constant tormentor throughout the night was gone. The incessant draughts that had snaked across the floor, chilling them to the marrow, had vanished. The air still smelled of decay and damp, but the oppressive, suffocating quality had lessened somehow, replaced by a strange and unnerving stillness. He felt a prickle of confusion disrupt the fog of his misery. He slowly got to his feet, his bad legs screaming in protest, and looked around the gloomy room. Everything appeared the same. The peeling plaster, the thick shrouds of cobwebs, the grimy floor. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. The house was no longer breathing its death rattle. It was holding its breath. And Leo felt a cold, inexplicable shiver crawl up his spine. a feeling that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room itself. "Daddy, look! The magic!" The voice was a pipe of pure, unadulterated wonder, slicing through the heavy silence. Leo's head snapped toward the sound. Maya was already on her feet, her small face alight with an expression he hadn't seen since they left the city. Pure joy. She wasn't pointing at a spider or a strange pattern in the dust. She was pointing, with a trembling, excited finger, at the nearest window frame. Leo's heart gave a violent, painful lurch in his chest. His mind instantly jumped to the worst possible conclusions. Had a wild animal gotten in? Had part of the frame collapsed? He braced himself for a new horror, for another piece of this disastrous puzzle to fall into place and crush what little was left of his spirit. He limped towards her, his body tense with dread, his mind screaming. What now? He felt a surge of protective fear for Maya, standing so close to what he assumed was another danger in this house of dangers, this monument to his failure. He reached her side and followed her gaze, and what he saw made the world tilt on its axis. The air rushed out of his lungs in a silent, shocked gasp. It was impossible. The window, the one that had been a dark, jagged maw of shattered glass and splintered wood, was perfect. It was whole. A single, pristine sheet of glass sat immaculately fitted into the old, grimy wooden frame. There wasn't a crack. There wasn't a fracture. There wasn't even a smudge of dust on its gleaming surface. It was as if the destruction had been a dream, a figment of his exhausted imagination. But he knew it was real. He remembered the sound of the wind howling through that very hole. He remembered seeing the bleak, grey sky through it. His brain stuttered, refusing to process the information his eyes were feeding it. It was a complete and utter violation of logic, a miracle planted in the middle of his own personal hell. He just stood there, frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open in stunned, silent disbelief. A violent tremor started in his hand and spread through his entire body. It was a jolt of pure, undiluted shock, so powerful that it momentarily erased the throbbing pain in his leg. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the pale morning light, a symptom of hunger and exhaustion. He reached out a trembling hand, his calloused, dirty fingertips moving as if through water. He had to know, he had to touch it. His fingers made contact with the surface. It was cool, smooth, and undeniably solid. It was real glass. The shock ricocheted through him, a wave of cold fire. He felt a surge of raw panic clawing at his throat. His mind, the logical mind of a builder who understood materials and physics, was screaming in protest. Glass doesn't just reappear. Windows don't just fix themselves. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, as if the fundamental laws of the universe had suddenly been suspended just for him in this one derelict house in the middle of nowhere. A frantic, desperate energy seized him. He had to see the others. Was it just this one? A single, inexplicable anomaly. He half stumbled, half ran from the room, his limp forgotten in his haste, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He burst into the next room, the one he thought might have been a kitchen. His eyes shot to the small window over the space where a sink might have once been. It too was whole. Perfect. Not a single shard of broken glass on the floor beneath it. He spun around and rushed back to the front room, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The tall window facing the collapsed porch, the one that had looked like a hollowed-out eye socket in a skull, now stared back at him with a placid, glassy gaze. He felt a wave of vertigo, his hand reaching out to brace himself against the crumbling wall. Every single one. Every broken window in the house had been seamlessly, impossibly, and silently repaired overnight. The house was now sealed. His rational mind, what was left of it, began to scramble, grasping for any possible explanation. A prank, a cruel, elaborate joke played on the new, desperate owner. But the idea died as soon as it formed. There were no footprints in the thick, undisturbed layer of dust that coated the floors. Not a single one, other than their own from the night before. There were no discarded tools, no tubes of sealant, no stray shards of glass. The silence of the house was absolute. And then another thought, even more chilling. A local charity, someone taking pity on them. But who could have possibly known they were here? They had arrived in the dead of night, seen by no one but the silent taxi driver. And who could work with such impossible speed and silence? The house was no longer just a ruin. It was an enigma. He felt the fine hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stand on end. He had the distinct, unnerving sensation that they were being watched, not by a person, but by the house itself. "It's the house, Daddy. It fixed itself for us. It knew we were cold." Maya's voice, filled with a pure, childish delight, was a stark and terrifying contrast to the cold dread that was now coiling in the pit of Leo's stomach. She was dancing a little jig in the middle of the room, her fear from the previous night completely forgotten, replaced by a belief in what she called house magic. To her, this was a fairy tale come to life, a sign that they were welcome. To Leo, it was the opposite. This was not a welcome. It was a display of power, something unnatural and deeply unsettling. This wasn't magic. It was a message. But from whom? And what did it mean? The question hung in the still air of the room, a silent, screaming enigma. The mystery of their survival had been suddenly and completely overshadowed by the mystery of the house itself. He felt a new kind of fear, a fear of the unknown that was far more potent than the fear of simple poverty or homelessness. This single, impossible event changed everything. It shifted Leo's entire focus. His mission was no longer simply to find a way to escape this ruin. His mission was now to understand it. He looked around the room, and his perception of the space was fundamentally altered. It was no longer just a pile of rotting wood and crumbling plaster. It was a puzzle, a complex, intricate puzzle box, and he was standing right in the middle of it. A flicker of his old self, the construction worker, the man who solved problems and understood how things were put together, began to stir beneath the thick, suffocating layers of despair and self-loathing. He had to find the source. He had to find the answer. The house had thrown down a gauntlet, and despite his fear, or perhaps because of it, he felt an overwhelming compulsion to pick it up. He had to know the secret behind the impossible windows. That need, that sudden, sharp curiosity, was the first real thing he'd felt in days. He made a decision. He would start with a methodical search. He would examine the house not as a shelter, but as a crime scene, or a miracle scene. He didn't know which. He returned to the first window, the one Maya had spotted, in what he assumed was the main living area. He knelt down slowly, the joints in his good knee cracking in protest, the pain in his bad one flaring into a sharp, stabbing fire. He gritted his teeth and ignored it. The need for answers was a louder noise than the pain. He began his examination, running his calloused fingers over the junction where the new, smooth glass met the old, weathered wood of the frame. He was looking for any clue, any tiny sign of the hand that had performed this impossible feat. A tool mark, a drop of glue, a fingerprint in the dust. But there was nothing. It was perfect. The craftsmanship was beyond anything he had ever seen, a seamless and invisible repair. It was as if the glass had simply grown there. As he shifted his weight, leaning in closer to inspect the lower edge of the frame, the palm of his hand pressed down hard on the floorboards directly beneath the windowsill, and that's when he heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, just a subtle but distinct difference. A dull, hollow thump. Not the solid, reassuring thud of the other floorboards he had been kneeling on. His entire body went rigid. His breathing stopped. He held his position for a moment, listening to the frantic, sudden hammering of his own heart. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his hand, and then pressed down again in the exact same spot. Thump. There it was again. A pocket of air, something hollow beneath the floor. A jolt of pure, electric adrenaline shot through his veins, sharp and metallic on his tongue. He had found something. It wasn't the answer to the windows, not yet, but it was a new thread. It was another piece of the impossible puzzle. He knocked on the board with his knuckles, the sound echoing slightly in the silent room. Thump, thump, thump. It was unmistakable. This small section of the floor, maybe 3 feet long, was different from all the rest. He felt a powerful tremor of anticipation run through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a feeling he thought was long dead. It was a potent cocktail of fear and a strange, exhilarating curiosity. What was under there? A root cellar, a collapsed pipe, or something else? The mystery of the windows suddenly seemed to connect to this new discovery, a second open loop in the story of this house. His mind, which moments before had been a swamp of despair, was now racing, firing with possibilities. He forgot about the cold, he forgot about his hunger. He was completely consumed by the need to see what was hidden beneath his hand. This house was giving up its secrets, one by one. He had to get it open, but he had no tools, not a hammer, not a crowbar, nothing. He looked at his own hands. They were the only tools he had. They were strong hands, calloused and powerful from years of working with steel and concrete. He scanned the edges of the hollow-sounding boards, searching for a seam, a weakness, a place to begin. He found a tiny gap where one plank met the next. He dug the nails of his right hand into the crack, his fingers straining against the wood. It wouldn't budge. He wedged the fingers of his other hand in as well and pulled, putting his back and shoulders into it, grunting with the effort. The old wood groaned in protest, resisting him. He felt a sharp, biting pain as a long splinter drove itself deep under his thumbnail. He cried out, but he didn't stop pulling. He was too close. The secret was right there, just inches away. The pain was nothing compared to the burning need to know. With a final, desperate heave that sent a bolt of agony up his arm from the splinter, something gave. There was a sound of screeching, rusty metal, and a rectangular section of the floorboards, about the size of a suitcase, lifted up on one side. It was a door, a hidden trapdoor, its hinges so cleverly concealed that it was completely invisible. He stared down into a dark, perfectly cut cavity in the subfloor, a secret compartment. The air that rose up to meet him was cool and dry, a stark contrast to the dampness of the rest of the house. It carried a strange, clean scent, a mixture of old paper, worn leather, and something else he couldn't quite place, a faint, metallic, oily smell, like a well-cared-for machine. He peered into the darkness, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The compartment wasn't empty. There was something inside, something large and dark and dense. Nestled perfectly within the hidden space, as if it had been waiting for him, was a chest. But it wasn't the kind of wooden, pirate-style chest he might have imagined. This was different. It was made of a dull, heavy-looking grey metal that seemed to absorb the faint light filtering into the room, giving it a somber, serious presence. He recognized the material instantly from his construction days, from handling shielding for X-ray rooms. It was lead, a solid, lead-lined chest. His mind reeled with the implications. Lead was used for one primary reason: to shield something, to protect what was inside from the outside world, or to protect the outside world from what was inside. The question slammed into him with physical force. What could possibly be so important, or so dangerous, that it needed to be sealed in a box of solid lead and hidden beneath the floor of a ruined house? The mystery deepened, another layer peeling back to reveal a darker, more complex core. He had to get it out. He leaned over the opening, his arms straining as he gripped the sides of the chest. It was incredibly heavy. The dense, unforgiving weight of the lead was staggering. It took every ounce of his strength, his legs shaking and the muscles in his back screaming, to hoist it up and out of the compartment. He half lifted, half dragged it onto the dusty floor, where it landed with a low, solid, definitive thud that seemed to shake the room. The sound was one of finality, a secret, unearthed after who knows how many years of silence. Maya, who had been watching him with wide, silent eyes, took a hesitant step back, her awe now tinged with a palpable sense of trepidation. She could feel the importance of this moment, the sudden shift in the air. Leo knelt beside the chest, his breath coming in ragged pants, his hands covered in dust, a smear of blood welling up from under his torn thumbnail. He stared at the plain, grey box, his mind racing. There was no keyhole, no combination dial, just a simple, heavy metal latch on the front. He felt a profound moment of hesitation, his hand hovering over the cold, smooth surface of the latch. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart. Every wild possibility imaginable flashed through his mind in a dizzying cascade. Was it gold? The life savings of some long-dead miser? Was it weapons? Or something far worse? Something that explained the house's isolation? He could feel Maya's eyes on him. He took a deep, steadying breath, the cool, musty air filling his lungs. Then, with a decisive movement, he flipped the latch. It moved with a surprising, well-oiled smoothness, and the heavy lead lid swung open with a soft, satisfying hiss of displaced air, revealing the contents within. His breath caught in his throat. The first thing he saw was not the warm, buttery glow of gold or the hard, brilliant sparkle of diamonds. The interior of the chest was lined with a faded, royal blue velvet, and nestled within it was a sight that was both beautiful and utterly bewildering. On the top layer, arranged in custom-cut slots, was a complete set of antique tools. They were exquisite, tiny, jewel-like screwdrivers with polished rosewood handles, delicate tweezers and pliers made of shining brass, a series of magnifying loops with crystal-clear lenses set in gleaming chrome. They were the tools of a master craftsman, a watchmaker or a jeweler. They were pristine, immaculate, without a speck of dust or a hint of tarnish, as if they had been placed in the chest only yesterday. He picked up one of the small screwdrivers. It felt perfectly balanced, cold and precise in his large, calloused hand. It was an object of profound care and skill. But what was it doing here? Beneath the velvet tray of tools, he found the books. There were 3 of them, each one bound in dark, supple leather that was still soft to the touch after years of confinement. The edges of the pages were gilded, and they shimmered faintly in the weak light. He lifted the top one out. It was heavy, substantial. The paper inside was thick and creamy, filled from edge to edge with dense, elegant handwriting. The script was beautiful but entirely alien to him, a series of sharp, angular letters, German. He couldn't understand a single word, but he could feel the intent and intelligence behind the script. This was a journal, a diary, the meticulous record of a life. The scent of old paper and leather rose from the pages, a smell of time and memory. He felt a sense of profound intrusion, like he was holding someone's soul in his hands, whose life was chronicled in these mysterious, unreadable pages. He carefully set the first journal aside and reached back into the chest. Tucked into a leather sleeve inside the cover of the last and thickest journal was a tightly folded sheaf of papers. They were brittle with age, and he unfolded them with the utmost care, his fingers clumsy and thick compared to the delicate documents. They were blueprints, but not for a building. They were incredibly detailed, intricate schematics of gears, springs, counterweights, and levers. It was clockwork, but it wasn't for a clock or a watch. The diagrams showed these complex mechanisms integrated into the structure of a house, hidden within walls, under floors, connected to window frames. A sudden, shocking realization hit him like a physical blow. He was looking at the blueprints for this house. The house itself was a machine. A cold shock, a mixture of terror and awe, ran the length of his spine. The impossible windows now had an impossible explanation. At the very bottom of the lead-lined chest, tucked away beneath the last journal in a separate waterproof oilskin pouch, was a thin, flat portfolio. His hands, which had been steady, now trembled uncontrollably as he worked open the stiff pouch. Inside were several large, official-looking documents, printed on heavy, cream-colored paper bearing an elaborate watermark. The bulk of the text was in the same dense German, but he could recognize certain things. He saw the name of a prominent Swiss bank, a crest, and a series of long, official-looking numbers, and he recognized the format. These were financial instruments, bearer bonds. A chill went through him as his eyes fell upon a single, stark date printed clearly on each document, 1945. Ancient history. Valuable paper that belonged to a world that no longer existed. He felt dizzy, the scale of his discovery expanding exponentially with every new item he uncovered. This was far more than a simple treasure. He sat back on his heels, his gaze sweeping over the bizarre collections spread out on the dusty floorboards before him. The exquisite, precise watchmaking tools, the cryptic, leather-bound journals filled with elegant German script, the impossible, mind-bending blueprints for a clockwork house, and the portfolio of decades-old Swiss bearer bonds. This wasn't a random collection of valuables. This was a narrative, a life story, meticulously packed and hidden away for more than half a century, waiting. He felt the sheer immensity of it settle over him, a weight far heavier than the lead-lined chest he had struggled to lift. He was no longer just a trespasser in a ruin. He was an archaeologist who had just stumbled upon a lost tomb, a tomb filled not with a body, but with the preserved remnants of a life of genius, secrecy, and sorrow. The story was all here. He knew it. If only he could read the words. Then, the final pieces clicked together in his mind with a sudden, stunning clarity. The blueprints for the clockwork mechanisms hidden in the walls, the impossibly and perfectly repaired windows. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a helpful ghost. It was a machine, a complex, dormant automaton, a guardian built into the very bones of the house, designed to perform maintenance, to preserve its own structure. And his arrival, their presence within the walls after decades of stillness, must have been the trigger, the switch that brought the house's secret, mechanical soul back to life. The house hadn't fixed itself. A brilliant, mysterious stranger had designed it to do so, long, long ago. But who would do such a thing? And more importantly, why? The question opened up a vast, new chasm of mystery, deeper and more compelling than anything he could have imagined. Who was the ghost in this machine? He looked around the decaying room, at the peeling wallpaper and the grimy floor, but he saw it all with new eyes. This was no longer just a ruin, a symbol of his own failure. It was a sanctuary, a fortress of secrets, designed with genius and incredible care. This wasn't a place of abandonment. It was a place of deliberate, active preservation. Every groaning floorboard, every crumbling patch of plaster, now seemed to hum with a latent energy, to hold a piece of this profound and unfolding mystery. The raw, animal fear that had gripped him since his arrival, the fear of cold and hunger and failure, was slowly being replaced by something else entirely, a sense of profound awe, of wonder, and a fierce, burgeoning, protective curiosity. He had to protect this place. He had to protect this story. He felt an undeniable connection to the unknown person who had built this incredible legacy. With movements that were now slow and reverent, he began to place each item carefully back into the lead-lined chest. He handled the tools, the journals, and the bonds as if they were sacred relics, because they were. These weren't just objects. They were the last will and testament of a ghost, the ghost in the machine, a ghost who, by revealing this secret, had just given Leo and Maya something far more valuable than shelter or gold. It had given them a purpose. It had given him a purpose. As he closed the heavy lead lid, the soft hiss of air sealing the contents once more, he felt a profound and irreversible shift inside him. He was no longer a victim, a piece of driftwood tossed on the waves of misfortune. He was now the keeper of a secret, the guardian of a legacy that he instinctively knew was both incredibly important and dangerously valuable, and he would protect it. The frantic energy of discovery quickly bled away, replaced by the crushing weight of a secret he could not comprehend. Leo felt the cool metal of the chest under his trembling fingertips, a direct link to a past that was suddenly, terrifyingly alive. He had to know more. He looked at his phone, the cracked screen displaying its final, dying breath of power. 7%. It was a cruel joke. He had a key to a ghost story, but only minutes to use it. With a surge of desperate resolve, he decided he would use every last electron of power in this tiny device to punch a hole through time, to pull words from the silent, elegant script of the journals. He carefully opened the first leather-bound volume, the faint, dry scent of old paper and ink filling the air, a fragrance of forgotten time and buried memories. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drum beat against the profound, oppressive silence of the house. He was about to disturb the dead, and he could only pray they would speak to him in a language he could understand before the light of his modern world faded to black. With shaking hands, he activated the translation app on his phone, the camera's blue focusing square feeling like a sacrilegious intrusion on the delicate, handwritten page. He aimed it at the first line of script. The phone whirred, its processor straining, and then, Like a ghost materializing from mist, words began to shimmer into existence on his screen. "My name is Klaus Richter." The app flickered. "My name is Klaus Richter." A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through Leo. The ghost had a name. He felt a sudden, profound connection, a shiver crawling up his spine, as if Klaus himself were in the room, whispering over his shoulder. He scrolled the camera down the page, his battery draining with alarming speed. Fragments of a life began to emerge from the dense German script, a story told in shattered pieces. He saw dates: Berlin, 1938, then Dachau, 1942. The name of a place he knew only from history books. A cold, hard knot of dread formed in the pit of his stomach. This was not a treasure map. This was a testament. The battery icon flashed red. 4%. Leo's hands grew slick with sweat. He scanned frantically, his eyes darting across the page, letting the app do its work in disjointed, agonizing bursts. The words that appeared on the screen were a litany of horrors, cold and factual in their digital translation, but screaming with unspoken pain. Forced labor, the workshop of horrors. Tasked with cataloguing the spoils, Leo felt a wave of nausea. He realized with sickening clarity that Klaus Richter's genius, his skill with tiny gears and delicate springs, had been perverted. He hadn't been a collaborator, he had been a prisoner, a Jewish master craftsman forced by his captors to appraise and repair the very treasures stolen from his own people. Leo felt the heavy leather of the journal, the weight of a history far darker than he could have ever imagined. He had unearthed not a fortune, but the evidence of an unimaginable crime, a story of profound suffering and unbearable guilt. He turned a few pages, his finger landing on an entry that was smudged, as if by tears. The phone's camera struggled to focus. 3%. The translation was slow, torturous. The Rosenberg collection. The entry spoke of a family, watchmakers from Vienna, whose entire collection of priceless, historic timepieces was brought to Klaus's workbench. He described them with a loving, meticulous detail that was heartbreaking, listing each one by name. A horologist's elegy for stolen art. He wrote of the father, a man he had admired, and then the final, brutal sentence materialized on the screen. "Today they were taken east. I could not save them. I am a cataloguer of ghosts." Leo's heart clenched in a vice of sorrow. He looked over at Maya, sleeping peacefully on the floor, her small chest rising and falling, a beacon of innocence in this house of ghosts. He felt a surge of fierce, protective rage, an anger at a long-dead injustice that felt suddenly terribly personal. His battery was now at 1%. He had seconds left. He fumbled with the portfolio of bonds, pulling one out. The paper felt brittle, sacred. He aimed the phone at the official text. Words flashed and vanished. "Issued, Bank of Switzerland, in the name of..." The name was there, clear as day. Rosenberg. The phone screen went black. Dead, but it was enough. The pieces slammed into place in Leo's mind with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't Klaus Richter's fortune. It was a debt, a sacred trust. He had somehow managed to smuggle out the liquidated assets of the family he could not save. A desperate, final act of restitution. The tools, the journals, the bonds. It was all a time capsule of remembrance. The lead-lined chest wasn't just to hide the treasure. It was to protect a promise. It was to shield the last remnant of the Rosenberg family from the corrosive touch of a world that had erased them. Leo sat back, his head spinning. He was the guardian of a murdered family's legacy. He now understood the house itself. He remembered the blueprints, the intricate clockwork. It wasn't the creation of a madman. It was the desperate act of a survivor haunted by what he had seen. In the journals, Klaus had called America a land of loud silence, a place where he felt safe but profoundly alone. This house was his fortress against the ghosts of his past, and the automaton, the silent guardian in the walls, was his final masterpiece. After being forced to work on instruments of theft, he had built a machine whose only purpose was to preserve and protect. It was not magic. It was a deeply personal, mechanical prayer, a complex, beautiful, and heartbreaking act of defiance against the forces of decay and destruction that had consumed his world. The house wasn't just a machine. It was a sanctuary built by a man trying to mend his own shattered soul by ensuring that at least one thing he created in the world would endure. The sudden absolute silence that followed his phone's death was more jarring than any noise. The dim room, moments before alive with the ghosts of history, was once again just a decaying, empty space. But now, it was filled with the immense, unspoken weight of Klaus Richter's story. Leo felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. He was the sole inheritor of this knowledge, the only living person who knew the truth hidden beneath the floorboards. The story felt too large, too heavy for one man to carry. He felt the rough texture of the splinter in his thumb, a small, sharp pain that grounded him in the present. As he sat there, paralyzed by the enormity of his discovery, a new sound cut through the silence. It was a sound so alien, so out of place in this world of rot and stillness, that it made his blood run cold. It was the low, powerful rumble of an engine, growing steadily closer. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, a wild, panicked bird trapped in a cage, a car. Out here, the sound was a violation, an invasion. His first instinct was pure animal panic. The chest. He had to hide the chest. He scrambled on the floor, his bad leg twisting under him in a flash of white-hot pain. He ignored it. He shoved the journals, the tools, the portfolio of bonds back inside the lead-lined box. The weight was immense, and he grunted with the effort, his muscles screaming as he dragged it back towards its hiding place. The engine noise was louder now, right outside. A vehicle had stopped. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel and dead leaves. With a final, desperate heave, he lowered the chest into its cavity and dropped the wooden trapdoor back into place. It settled with a soft thud that was deafening in the silence. He kicked dust over the seams just as the shadow of a large truck fell across the doorway. A man stepped out, and he was the living embodiment of power and privilege. He wore clean, dark jeans, expensive leather boots that had never seen a day of hard work, and a crisp flannel shirt that looked like it had been pulled from a catalogue. His hair was perfectly styled, and a pair of reflective sunglasses hid his eyes, giving him an unnerving, predatory look. He exuded an aura of casual, confident ownership, as if the entire desolate landscape belonged to him. This was Mr. Thompson. He put his hands on his hips and surveyed the broken-down house, his lips twisting into a smirk of disdain. His gaze swept over the ruin before landing, with a flicker of something that looked like surprise, on the newly repaired windows. He took off his sunglasses, and Leo saw his eyes for the first time. They were pale blue, cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a shark that had just scented blood in the water. "Well, now, look what the cat dragged in." The voice was smooth, a rich baritone laced with condescending amusement. Thompson strode towards the house, his expensive boots crunching on the collapsed porch steps with an air of complete indifference. He didn't knock. He simply stopped in the empty doorway, a dark silhouette against the bleak morning light. He filled the entire frame, a looming presence of unwelcome authority. Leo felt a primal urge to shield his daughter, instinctively maneuvering himself so that his body was between Maya and the intruder. Thompson's cold eyes flicked over Leo, taking in the dirty clothes, the exhausted pallor of his skin, the awkward way he stood to favor his bad leg. The man's gaze was an assessment, a calculation of weakness. Leo felt himself being stripped bare, weighed, and measured. And in the cold calculus of those eyes, he knew he had been found wanting. Thompson's lips curled into a smile that didn't touch his eyes, didn't expect to find any tenants. "Name's Thompson. My family's been trying to acquire this worthless piece of dirt for decades." He gestured vaguely at the ruin. "You must be the fella from the city who overpaid for it. Got to say, I'm surprised you made it out here." His gaze shifted, landing on the pristine window right behind Leo. He feigned a look of curiosity. "That's funny. Last time I was by, this place was wide open to the elements, every window smashed. You work fast." The words were light, almost friendly, but the question underneath was a sharp, pointed probe, testing him, searching for a reaction. Leo felt a bead of cold sweat trace a path down his spine. The air grew thick with unspoken accusation. He had to be careful. Every word, every glance, was now part of a dangerous game he didn't know the rules to. Leo remained silent, His jaw clenched. He simply stared back, refusing to give the man anything. Thompson's smile tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "All right, let's cut the crap," he said, the friendly facade dissolving. "I know the stories about this place. Old man Richter's Nazi gold. My grandfather spent his life looking for it. A family obsession." He laughed, a short, ugly bark that held no humor. "He always said the crazy old kraut hid it here. I was about to buy this dump at auction just to tear it apart and settle the matter once and for all. But you beat me to it." He pulled a thick roll of cash from his pocket, peeling off a few bills. "I'll give you 10,000, double what you paid. You take your kid, you walk away, and you forget you were ever here." The money was an insult, a clear demonstration of how little he valued Leo's position. The offer hung in the air, thick with the scent of old money and new threats. $10,000. A month ago, that amount would have been a miracle, a lifeline. Now, it felt like blood money. Leo thought of Klaus Richter, a man forced to catalogue the death of his people. He thought of the Rosenberg family, erased from the world, their last legacy resting in a lead box just a few feet away. He thought of the house itself, a monument to survival and remembrance. This wasn't Thompson's land to buy. It wasn't his story to plunder. It belonged to the ghosts. A surge of unexpected, defiant strength flowed through him. "It's not for sale," Leo heard himself say. The words came out quiet but firm, a line drawn in the dust. He saw a flash of genuine surprise in Thompson's eyes, quickly replaced by something much darker, much colder. The game had just changed. Thompson's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. The last vestiges of civility vanished. He took a menacing step into the house, his physical presence overwhelming the small space. His voice dropped to a low, venomous hiss, each word a carefully chosen weapon. "You're making a mistake, a big one." He leaned in close, and Leo could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne, a sickeningly sweet odor in the midst of all the decay. "This land is in the middle of nowhere. A single father, a man with a handicap." He glanced down at Leo's bad leg with open contempt. It would be a real shame if something were to happen out here. A real shame if a little girl got hurt because her daddy was too stupid and too stubborn to know when to walk away. He wasn't just threatening Leo anymore. He was aiming his poison directly at the one thing in the world Leo couldn't bear to lose. He was aiming at Maya. Thompson held his gaze, a predator savoring the fear in his prey's eyes. The threat hung between them, a glittering, venomous promise. Then, with a chillingly abrupt shift, he straightened up, his face smoothing back into a mask of cold indifference. He gave a small, mocking smile. "Think it over," he said, his voice once again casual. He turned and strode back to his truck, the crunch of his boots the only sound in the tense silence. The engine roared to life, a violent, angry sound that tore at the quiet air. With a spray of gravel and dirt, the truck sped away, its trail of dust hanging in the air like a fading curse. Leo stood trembling, not from the cold, but from a rage so pure and a fear so profound it left him breathless. He was trapped. He was the guardian of a sacred trust, standing against a monster who would stop at nothing. What would you do in his place? Would you take the money, ensuring your child's safety and abandoning a dead man's legacy? Or would you stay and fight for justice, knowing that the monster you defy has already threatened the one person you love more than life itself? The dust from Thompson's truck hung in the air like a ghostly shroud, a tangible remnant of his poisonous presence. Leo stood frozen, his entire body a single, rigid knot of terror and rage. The threat, so specific and vile, echoed in the cavernous silence of the house, replaying in his mind until the words lost their meaning and became pure, auditory poison. A single father, a gimpy leg, an accident. He felt a violent tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of the war raging inside his soul. His heart hammered a wild, frantic rhythm against his ribs, so loud he was sure it must be audible in the oppressive stillness. He looked over at Maya, who was now awake and watching him with wide, worried eyes, her small hand clutching the worn fabric of his jeans. The sight of her innocent face, the target of Thompson's venomous promise, sent a wave of icy dread through him, so potent It almost buckled his knees. The house, moments before a place of awe and mystery, now felt like a trap, its priceless secret, the bait. He sank to the dusty floor, the pain in his leg a distant, irrelevant signal compared to the screaming agony in his heart. The $10,000. The offer was a cruel taunt, a test of his soul. He could take it. He could grab Maya, walk away from this place of ghosts and monsters, and find a small, safe apartment somewhere far away. They could have a real bed, hot meals, a semblance of a normal life. The temptation was a sweet, seductive poison, whispering of safety and an end to this waking nightmare. But then he felt the solid floorboards beneath him, the floorboards that hid Klaus Richter's legacy. He imagined the feel of the cool, leather-bound journals, the weight of the bearer bonds, the silent, elegant promise they represented. To walk away would be to hand that promise over to the grandson of a Nazi sympathizer, to let the final memory of the Rosenberg family be plundered for profit. It was a betrayal he wasn't sure he could live with. He felt his throat tighten, a sob of pure, helpless fury caught there. His gaze swept over the pristine, impossible windows, now gleaming in the pale afternoon light. They were no longer a miracle. They were a testament to Klaus's genius, his resilience. They were a shield, built by a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had still chosen to create, to protect. And now Leo, a broken construction worker, was the unlikely inheritor of that duty. The weight of it was crushing, a responsibility he had never asked for, dropped into his lap by a ghost. He looked at his own hands, calloused and stained with grime, one thumb throbbing with the dull pain of a fresh splinter. They were hands made for building, for putting things together, not for fighting monsters or guarding historical secrets. He felt a surge of overwhelming inadequacy. Who was he to stand against a man like Thompson, a man with money, power, and a complete absence of morality? He felt like a mouse standing in the path of a bulldozer, his only weapon a secret he barely understood. Just as the silence stretched to a breaking point, a new sound intruded, gentle and hesitant. A dry, rasping cough just beyond the open doorway. Leo's head snapped up, his body instantly coiling with renewed tension. He scrambled to his feet, pushing Maya behind his good leg, his heart leaping into his throat. His mind screamed, "He's back." But the figure that appeared in the doorway was not Thompson. It was an old man, stooped and frail, his body looking as weathered and ancient as the forest surrounding them. He wore faded overalls and a patched flannel shirt, his face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles. A pair of startlingly clear blue eyes, clouded with age but full of a gentle, weary wisdom, peered out from under the brim of a stained baseball cap. In one gnarled, arthritic hand, he held a long, hand-carved walking stick. The old man's gaze wasn't hostile. It was filled with a deep, profound sadness as he surveyed the room, his eyes lingering on Leo and his daughter. Saw the Thompson truck leaving in a hurry. Figured I should come see if the house was still standing. The man's voice was raspy, thin as dry leaves skittering across pavement, but it held a surprising strength. He has no right to be on this land. Never did. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, leaning heavily on his walking stick. His eyes moved from Leo's face to the newly repaired windows, and a faint, knowing smile touched his lips. Looks like Klaus's final welcome gift is still in working order. He was a genius, that man, a tormented genius. He tapped the floor with his stick. My name is Samuel. My father was the only friend Klaus Richter ever had in this godforsaken county. I lived just over that ridge, been watching over this place, best I could, for near 50 years. The words landed in the room with the weight of history, a sudden, unexpected bridge to the past that Leo so desperately needed to cross. A flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, ignited in Leo's chest. Leo felt the tension drain from his shoulders, replaced by a wave of dizzying relief. He wasn't alone. This quiet, ancient man was a living link to the ghost in the machine. He was here, Leo managed to say, his voice hoarse. Thompson, he threatened us. Samuel nodded slowly, his expression grim, unsurprised. That's the Thompson way. His grandfather was a cruel man, filled with hate and greed. He suspected Klaus had escaped Germany with something valuable, something he felt entitled to. He called it Richter's Nazi gold, a disgusting lie. He tormented Klaus, spread rumors in town, tried to drive him off this land for years. But Klaus was tougher than any of them knew. He'd seen real monsters. Men like the Thompsons were just loud, pathetic little boys to him. Samuel's gaze was distant, lost in a memory of a pain that was not his own, but had been passed down to him like an unwanted inheritance. The story he told painted the background to Leo's fear, giving it a name and a history. My father. He would bring Klaus supplies. They'd sit on the porch, not talking much. My father said Klaus was always listening, always watching, as if he was waiting for the past to come crawling out of the woods. Samuel's voice dropped to a near whisper, a conspiratorial and solemn tone that drew Leo in. The Thompsons believe a lie. They think Klaus was a Nazi who stole gold. The truth is so much worse and so much more noble. Klaus was a victim, a survivor. What he brought here wasn't a treasure to be spent. It was a burden to be delivered, a debt of honor. Samuel's clear eyes met Leo's, and in their depths, Leo saw a perfect understanding. This old man knew. He knew the weight of the secret, the truth behind the German journals, and the purpose of the house itself. The sense of shared knowledge was a powerful, grounding force, pulling Leo back from the edge of his panic and despair. He finally had an ally. Samuel reached into the deep inner pocket of his worn jacket, his gnarled fingers fumbling for a moment before they emerged with a long, yellowed envelope. It was sealed on the back with a dark red blob of wax, impressed with a small, intricate design of interlocking gears. Klaus gave this to my father, the year before he passed away, Samuel explained, his voice thick with reverence. He made him swear an oath, to keep it safe, and to give it to the next worthy soul who came to live in this house. Someone who wasn't looking for gold, but for a home. Someone the house itself would accept. He extended the letter towards Leo. I've been the keeper of that oath for a long, long time. After seeing that coward Thompson here, and seeing you still standing, seeing the windows repaired, I think you're the one he was waiting for. Leo took the envelope. It felt warm, almost alive, humming with the latent energy of a decades-old promise. The paper was brittle, fragile, but the weight of it in his hand was immense. He held the letter as if it were a holy relic, his calloused fingers tracing the elegant wax seal. He could feel the faint indentations of the gear pattern, a final signature from the master watchmaker. The weight of this moment was almost unbearable. He was being officially passed the torch, not just by circumstance, but by the deliberate, long-planned design of Klaus Richter himself. He felt a profound connection to the men who had come before him, to Klaus, the haunted genius, and to Samuel and his father, the silent, steadfast guardians of his legacy. He was no longer just an interloper who had stumbled upon a secret. He was the chosen inheritor. A surge of purpose, clear and powerful, washed away the last vestiges of his fear and indecision. He knew what he had to do. He had to see this through, not just for himself and Maya, but for Klaus, for the Rosenbergs, and for the quiet, honorable man standing before him. What's inside? Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. He was almost afraid to know. Samuel gave him a sad, gentle smile. I don't know. My father never opened it. Klaus's instructions were clear. It's for you. But he did tell my father one thing. He said the letter contained a key, not to a safe, but to a weapon of truth, he called it. The only kind that matters against men who live on lies. Samuel's words resonated deep within Leo's soul. A weapon of truth. It was exactly what he needed. He looked from the letter to Samuel's weathered face, a face that radiated a simple, powerful integrity. Thank you, Leo said, the words feeling utterly inadequate to convey the depth of his gratitude. He had been drowning, and this man had just thrown him a lifeline woven from the threads of the past. He was still in danger, but he was no longer adrift. He now had a map and a destination, justice. With trembling fingers, Leo broke the wax seal. The small, sharp crack echoed in the silent room. He carefully unfolded the single, brittle sheet of paper inside. The text was in English, written in the same elegant, angular script as the journals. The ink was faded to a soft brown, but the words were clear, concise, and filled with a grim purpose. The letter was addressed to the new guardian of this house. It briefly explained the nature of the bonds as the rightful property of the Rosenberg family estate and stated Klaus's final wish that they be returned and that any remaining portion of the assets be used to help reunite families torn apart by conflict. It was a last will and testament, a final, desperate plea for justice from beyond the grave. The quiet dignity and profound hope contained in those few sentences brought a lump to Leo's throat. He felt the weight of Klaus's final, noble wish settle upon his shoulders, and at the bottom of the page was the key, the weapon. It was a name and a contact address in New York City, David Freilich, Esk, Holocaust-era, asset recovery. Beneath the name was a short, scribbled note. Mr. Freilich is the grandson of a man I once knew in Vienna. His family understands the language of ghosts. He can be trusted. A lawyer. A specialist. This was the piece Leo had been missing. It was a concrete plan. A direct line to the world outside this isolated patch of woods. A way to fight Thompson not with fists or fear, but with the full, crushing weight of the law and of history. He felt a surge of power, a feeling he hadn't experienced since before his accident. It wasn't physical strength, it was the strength of righteousness. The power that comes from knowing you are on the right side of a story that is bigger than you are. He carefully folded the letter and tucked it securely into his pocket, a shield over his heart. Samuel seemed to sense the shift in him. The old man nodded, a silent approval in his tired eyes. You best be careful, son. Thompson's not the kind to give up. He's been humiliated. His family's obsession has been thwarted by a man he sees as a cripple. His pride is wounded, and a man like that is more dangerous than a cornered rattlesnake. He'll be back, and he won't be coming back to talk. Samuel's warning was stark and devoid of any comforting platitudes. It was the grim, practical advice of a man who understood the nature of the local evil. The brief, fragile bubble of hope was pierced by a fresh spike of fear. The lawyer was in New York. The bonds were here, and Thompson was just down the road, his fury stewing. Leo knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that the real fight was not days or weeks away. It was coming, and it was coming soon. The house was no longer a fortress, it was a besieged castle. As if summoned by Samuel's grim prophecy, the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. The beauty of the sunset was a cruel irony, a magnificent spectacle that heralded the arrival of a new and terrifying darkness. The temperature began to drop rapidly, and the shadows of the skeletal trees outside grew long and distorted, clawing their way across the floor of the house. The atmosphere shifted, the brief respite of the afternoon giving way to a tense, charged anticipation. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves in the rising wind, sounded like a footstep. Leo felt his nerves stretch taut, his senses on high alert. He was a sentry on a wall, guarding a priceless treasure, peering into a darkness that he knew held a monster. He could feel the seconds ticking by, each one a grain of sand falling in an hourglass, counting down to a violent confrontation. Samuel seemed to feel it too. He cast a worried look out the newly paned window into the gathering gloom. "You and the girl," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You shouldn't stay here tonight. Thompson's a coward, but he's a coward with resources. He'll bring his hired muscle. You should come back to my place. It's small, but it's safe. We can call that lawyer from there in the morning." The offer was a lifeline, a tangible path to safety. But Leo's eyes went to the trapdoor in the floor. The chest was too heavy. He couldn't possibly carry it, not with his bad leg, not through the woods in the dark. He couldn't leave it. It was the heart of the whole story. It was the proof. It was Klaus's soul, and the Rosenbergs' only remaining legacy. Leaving it behind felt like an impossible choice, a strategic and moral failure. "I can't," Leo said, his voice tight. "I can't leave it." Samuel's face was etched with understanding and deep concern. He knew, without being told, what Leo was protecting. "All right then," he said, his tone resolute. "If you won't come to safety, I'll bring a piece of it to you." He turned and walked out the door, his movements surprisingly brisk for a man of his age. Leo watched him go, a knot of confusion and fear in his stomach. What was he doing? Was he abandoning them? The thought sent a fresh jolt of panic through him. He was alone again, with his daughter and a secret that was growing more dangerous by the minute. He felt the crushing weight of his decision to stay. Had he just doomed them both? Had his newfound sense of duty blinded him to his most important responsibility, protecting Maya? The doubt was a bitter acid in his throat. He looked at Maya, who was watching him with silent trust, and he felt a fresh wave of terror at the possibility that he was about to fail her in the most catastrophic way imaginable. A few minutes later, Samuel returned. In his hands, he carried a dusty, ancient-looking oil lantern and a heavy, double-bitted axe, its steel head gleaming dully in the fading light. He set them both on the floor. "Not much," he grunted, "but the dark is where cowards get brave. A little light can be a powerful deterrent. And this," he patted the smooth, worn handle of the axe, "this is for when the light isn't enough." He also handed Leo a small, battered cell phone. "It's old, but the battery is full. The signal is weak out here, but if you stand by that north window, you might get a bar. It's better than nothing." The practical gifts, the lantern, the axe, the phone, were a stark and terrifying acknowledgement of the reality of their situation. The time for stories and history was over. The time for survival had begun. Samuel's quiet, grim preparations made the impending threat feel more real and immediate than ever before. Samuel looked at Maya, his weathered face softening. He knelt down, his old joints protesting with a groan. "Don't you worry, little one," he said, his voice a gentle rasp. "This old house has secrets. It looks after its own." He then looked at Leo, his expression hardening with grim resolve. "Remember what Klaus built. He didn't just build a home. He built a fortress. He was a watchmaker. He understood that every gear has its purpose. Trust the house." With a final nod, Samuel left them, disappearing back into the deepening twilight. His final words, "Trust the house," echoed in Leo's mind. He looked at the blueprints he had briefly seen, the intricate diagrams of gears and levers hidden within the walls. He had no idea how they worked, what triggered them, or what they did. But Samuel's words planted a seed of an idea, a desperate, insane strategy that began to form in the panicked chaos of his thoughts. Night fell completely, a thick blanket of absolute blackness that swallowed the world. Leo lit the lantern, and its warm, flickering glow pushed back the shadows, creating a small, fragile island of light in the oppressive dark. The flame cast huge, dancing silhouettes on the walls, making the room feel both smaller and more menacing. He sat with his back against a wall, the heavy axe resting within arm's reach, Maya asleep with her head in his lap. He strained his ears, listening to the symphony of the night, the sighing of the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the frantic skittering of unseen things in the walls. Every sound was magnified, distorted by his fear into something threatening. He felt a primal, gut-wrenching dread, the ancient fear of the dark and what it might be hiding. His hand rested on Maya's small shoulder, her steady, peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of his own heart. He was a statue of vigilance, waiting, and then he heard it. At first, it was just a low, distant thrum. A vibration felt more in his bones than heard with his ears, but it grew steadily, quickly, resolving itself into the familiar, hated sound, the guttural, angry rumble of Thompson's truck. But this time it was different. It was accompanied by the sound of a second engine, another vehicle. Leo's blood ran cold. He felt the air leave his lungs in a silent rush. Samuel was right. He wasn't alone. He had come back with his muscle. A wave of pure, undiluted terror washed over Leo. He gently shook Maya awake. "Sweetie, I need you to be very quiet now. We're going to play a game of hide and seek. Okay?" His voice was a strained whisper, a pathetic attempt to mask the sheer panic that was threatening to consume him. Maya, sensing the fear in his voice, simply nodded, her eyes wide and dark in the lantern light. He had to think, he had to act, but his mind was a maelstrom of white noise and fear. Bright, piercing headlights swept across the front of the house, slicing through the windows and illuminating the room in a blinding, sterile glare. The truck screeched to a halt just outside, the engines cutting out abruptly, plunging them back into the semi-darkness of the lantern's glow. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with violence. Then a car door slammed, then another, and another. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched on the gravel, and dead leaves outside. They were coming. Leo's heart felt like it was going to explode in his chest. He grabbed the axe, its weight both terrifying and reassuring in his trembling hand. He could hear voices, low and menacing, Thompson's smooth baritone and the rough, guttural grunts of two other men. They were on the porch now. The wood groaned under their combined weight. There was no more time for strategy. There was only the raw, visceral certainty of imminent violence. There was no knock. There was no final ultimatum. There was only a single, explosive crack as a heavy boot smashed into the front door, splintering the frame. The door flew open, slamming against the interior wall with a deafening bang. 3 dark figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. In the center was Thompson, his face a mask of smug, triumphant fury. Flanking him were 2 large, brutish men, their shapes bulky and menacing. They looked like predators who had finally cornered their prey. "Well, well," Thompson purred, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Still here. I tried to be reasonable. I really did. Now, you're going to give me my family's gold, or we're going to tear this house apart, board by board, and then we're going to tear you apart." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a raw, brutal promise. The 2 thugs stepped into the room, their eyes scanning the space, their presence sucking all the air out. In that split second, as the thugs advanced into the room, a profound and shocking clarity descended upon Leo. The fear didn't vanish, but it crystallized into a single, sharp point of focus. Trust the house. Samuel's words. Klaus Richter's blueprints. He remembered a specific diagram, a cluster of levers and gears hidden behind a loose panel of wainscoting near the main fireplace, labeled simply Verteidigung, defense. It was an insane gamble, a blind leap of faith based on a dead man's drawings and an old man's cryptic advice. But it was the only chance they had. He knew he couldn't fight these men, not with an axe, not with his bare hands. But maybe, just maybe, Klaus Richter still could. He had to try. He had to trust the ghost in the machine. He took a deep breath, the dusty air searing his lungs, and made his move, his body acting on a desperate, calculated instinct. "Maya, run! To the back room! Now!" he screamed, the command sharp and full of a desperate authority he didn't feel. The sudden noise, the unexpected order, momentarily startled the thugs, making them hesitate for a fraction of a second. It was all the time he needed. He shoved the lantern into Thompson's chest, sending the man stumbling backward with a curse as hot oil sloshed onto his expensive shirt. The room was plunged into near-total darkness, the lantern flickering and dying on the floor. In the ensuing confusion, Leo didn't run towards the back of the house. He lunged sideways towards the great stone fireplace. His hands scrambled against the wall in the dark, searching for the loose panel he had only seen in a diagram. His fingers found a seam, a small crack in the wood. He jammed his nails into the gap and pulled with all his might. The panel swung open with a soft click. Inside, his fingers met cold, hard metal, a row of levers. He had no idea what they did. He didn't have time to choose. With a desperate prayer to a ghost he'd never met, he grabbed all of them and pulled down hard. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. He felt a surge of despair. It was a failure. Then, the house came alive. A deep, grinding groan echoed from within the walls, the sound of immense, ancient gears turning for the first time in half a century. It was a sound of protest, of awakening. A loud metallic clang reverberated through the floor as a heavy iron bolt, thick as a man's wrist, shot across the inside of the broken front door, sealing it shut. From the next room, there was a deafening crash, as if a solid wall had just slammed down from the ceiling, blocking the hallway. The thugs yelled in surprise and confusion, their flashlights cutting panicked, jerky beams through the darkness. The house was a cacophony of mechanical noise, grinding, whirring, and a series of loud, rhythmic clicks echoed from all around them, a symphony of controlled chaos. A section of the floor near the thugs suddenly dropped a few inches with a jarring thud, throwing them off balance. "What the hell is this?" one of them roared, his voice tight with fear. Thompson was screaming, his voice a mixture of fury and panic. "Find him! Find the girl!" But the house was now a labyrinth. The sounds were disorienting, coming from everywhere at once, turning the simple layout of the rooms into a confusing, unpredictable maze. Leo didn't wait to see more. He scrambled back to where Maya was hiding, her small face pale with terror in the strobing flashlight beams. He grabbed her hand. "Come on, sweetie. It's time to go," he whispered, his voice trembling with a wild, exhilarating terror. The house was fighting for them. He remembered another detail from the blueprints, a detail so small he had almost forgotten it. A hidden release for a cellar door, disguised as a loose stone in the hearth of the fireplace. He half-dragged, half-carried Maya to the fireplace, his hands searching frantically for the specific stone. He found it. It was cool and rough under his fingertips. He pressed it hard. There was a low groan of stone on stone, and a section of the floor beside the hearth sank away, revealing a dark, narrow opening and a set of steep stone steps leading down into the pitch-black earth. The air that rose up to meet them smelled of damp soil, cold stone, and deep, undisturbed time. This was their escape route, their rabbit hole, a secret exit built by a man who always knew he might have to flee in the dark. Leo felt a surge of profound, overwhelming gratitude for the long-dead watchmaker, the architect of their salvation. He didn't have the chest. The thought was a sharp, painful pang. It was still under the floorboards in the main room, where the thugs were stumbling around in the mechanical chaos. He couldn't go back for it. Not now. His heart ached at the thought of leaving it. But Maya's small, trembling hand in his was the only reality that mattered. He had to get her to safety. That was the only mission. He bundled her into the dark opening, her small body disappearing into the blackness. "Go down the stairs, sweetie. I'm right behind you," he urged. He took one last look back at the room, a chaotic scene of flashing lights and shouting men, a battle being fought by a ghost. Then he lowered himself into the hole, pulling the heavy stone door closed above him. It settled into place with a soft, final thump, plunging them into absolute, profound darkness and an even more profound silence. The sounds of the battle above instantly muffled, distant and unreal. The darkness in the cellar was total, a physical presence that pressed in on him from all sides. He could hear Maya's frightened, shallow breaths just below him. He fumbled in his pocket for the small, battered cell phone Samuel had given him. He switched on its weak flashlight, and the thin, pale beam cut a pathetic swathe through the gloom. They were in a narrow, hand-dug tunnel, the walls made of damp, packed earth and fieldstones. It was claustrophobic, the air thick and cold. He could see the bottom of the rough stone steps just a few feet below. He scrambled down, his bad leg sending a jolt of protest up his side. He gathered Maya into his arms, her small body shivering violently. "It's okay," he whispered, the lie catching in his throat. "We're okay." The tunnel stretched forward into the darkness, a longy black throat leading away from the house. He had no idea where it went, but anywhere was better than where they had just been. They stumbled through the tunnel, Leo limping heavily, his arm wrapped tightly around his daughter. The weak beam of the phone's light bobbed and danced ahead of them, revealing nothing but more of the endless dark tunnel. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own footsteps and ragged breathing. He felt like they were burrowing through the heart of the earth itself, ancient mariners in a sunless sea. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a change in the darkness ahead, a faint, grey light. His heart leaped. It was an exit. He pushed forward, his exhaustion forgotten in a final surge of adrenaline. The tunnel ended in a rough wooden door, swollen with damp. He put his shoulder to it and pushed. With a groan of protest, it swung open, and they stumbled out into the cool, clean air of the night, gasping as if they had just broken the surface after being held underwater. The stars above were a brilliant, shocking canopy of light. They had emerged from a small, cleverly hidden shed, its exterior disguised as a simple woodpile, about 100 yards from the house. From here, they could see the main structure, and it was a scene of utter chaos. Lights flashed erratically from within, and the grinding, mechanical noises were still audible, a dissonant symphony of defense. They could hear the faint, muffled shouts of Thompson and his men trapped inside the machine. A sense of awe washed over Leo. Klaus Richter hadn't just built a clockwork maintenance system. He had built a weapon. A non-violent, brilliant weapon of confusion and containment. It was the perfect creation for a man who had seen too much violence. He had turned his prison into a fortress. And now, decades later, that fortress had saved them. He looked away from the house and scanned the dark horizon. Far off, across a dark field and nestled in a grove of trees, he saw it. A single, warm point of yellow light. Samuel's house. Safety. They burst from the oppressive darkness of the tunnel into the crisp, cold night air, gasping like newborns. The single yellow light from Samuel's cabin was a lighthouse in a sea of black, a beacon of impossible hope. They stumbled across the field, Leo's leg a symphony of agony, his arm protectively around Maya. When they finally reached the small porch, the door swung open. Samuel stood there, his face grim but calm, a shotgun held loosely in one hand. He pulled them inside, into the overwhelming warmth and the rich, comforting smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. He took one look at their faces, pale and streaked with dirt, and simply nodded. He handed Leo a steaming mug, its heat a shocking, life-affirming jolt in his cold hands. As Maya collapsed into a deep, safe sleep on a worn armchair, Samuel pointed to a sturdy landline phone on the wall. "The number from the letter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's time to wake the ghosts." Leo's fingers trembled as he dialed, each number a step into a new world. The voice that answered was calm, professional, and immediately understood. The weapon of truth had been fired. The dawn broke, grey and cold, but it brought with it not despair, but justice. A convoy of unmarked state police cars, sleek and dark, crunched up the dirt track, their arrival a quiet, deadly serious intrusion. Leo and Samuel watched from the porch as the heavily armed officers, moving with silent, tactical precision, surrounded the Richter house. The intricate clockwork, its purpose served, had fallen silent. The police found Thompson and his thugs huddled in the main room, covered in dust, their flashlights dead, babbling incoherent stories about a haunted house that had turned on them. The arrest was swift and anticlimactic. Leo felt a strange detachment as he watched Thompson, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage, being forced into the back of a police car. The satisfying, metallic click of handcuffs closing around the wrists of the men who had terrorized them was a sound of profound finality, an ending to a chapter of fear that had lasted a lifetime but had ended in a single, chaotic night. The monster had been caged, not by violence, but by memory and gears. The next day, David Freilich arrived. He was not the powerful, shark-like lawyer Leo had imagined. He was a quiet, scholarly man in his late 60s, with kind eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 sorrows. He drove a modest car and wore a simple tweed jacket. He greeted Leo not with a handshake, but with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been a good guardian, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice soft. He asked to see the journals first. At Samuel's small kitchen table, he laid them out, handling the brittle leather with the reverence of a high priest handling sacred texts. He read passages aloud in the original German, his voice cracking with emotion. He translated Klaus Richter's final, desperate hopes, his guilt over the Rosenbergs, his defiant act of building this sanctuary. He confirmed everything Leo had pieced together, giving the ghost a voice and his sacrifice a witness. In that small, warm kitchen, the weight of history felt immense, a tangible presence that bound the three men together in a silent, solemn pact across generations. They returned to the house, now a secured crime scene. Leo, with Freilich and a visibly emotional Samuel by his side, showed the detectives the hidden trapdoor. The act of opening it again felt different. There was no fear, only a profound sense of purpose. As Leo lifted the heavy, lead-lined chest from its resting place, a hushed silence fell over the room. Freilich opened the lid, and the pristine watchmaking tools gleamed in the detective's flashlights. The lawyer's hands hovered over the bearer bonds, his breath catching. "My God," he whispered. They're real. I've only seen documents like this in museums. He explained their immense value, not just monetarily, but as historical artifacts. They were incontrovertible proof. The journals became primary evidence, detailing not just Klaus's ordeal, but the Thompson family's decades-long campaign of persecution, opening a far wider investigation into their history of profiting from hate. The treasure was not gold, it was truth, and it was finally being brought into the light. The months that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and quiet transformation. The story became a minor sensation, a testament to resilience and poetic justice. With David Freilich's guidance, a foundation was established in the Rosenberg family's name. Its initial endowment funded by the liquidated value of the bonds, which amounted to tens of millions of dollars. Klaus Richter's final wish was honored with a precision he would have appreciated. The Foundation's sole mission was to use its vast resources to fund international efforts to reunite families separated by war and genocide. A beautiful, hopeful machine built from the ashes of a tragic past. Leo would receive letters from Freilich, detailing the lives that were being pieced back together because of Klaus's courage and his own refusal to back down. He was no longer just the guardian of a secret. He was a silent partner in a global mission of healing. A legacy that brought a quiet, deep satisfaction that no amount of money could buy. And the money did come. As the legal discoverer and designated guardian of the assets, and with the full blessing of the newly formed Rosenberg Foundation, a substantial portion of the wealth was legally awarded to Leo. It was a sum so vast it felt unreal, a string of zeros on a page that his mind, so long accustomed to scarcity, could barely comprehend. He remembered standing on a cold city street, counting out his last $1,400. Now, he was looking at a bank statement that felt like a telephone number. The moment the funds were transferred, he didn't feel a wild surge of joy. Instead, a profound, bone-deep wave of relief washed over him, so powerful it made him sit down hard. It was the feeling of a crushing, lifelong weight being lifted from his soul. For the first time since his accident, for the first time in Maya's life, he could breathe. The constant, gnawing fear of the abyss, the dread of the next bill, the terror of homelessness, it all just vanished. Leo never considered leaving the house. It was more than a property. It was a character in their story, a savior. With his newfound resources, he began a meticulous restoration. He didn't gut it. He honored it. He hired a team of the finest craftspeople, stonemasons, master carpenters, artisan glaziers, who treated the project not as a job, but as the preservation of a work of art. The collapsed porch was rebuilt with solid oak. The roof was replaced, shingle by painstaking shingle. The crumbling plaster walls were restored, and the floors were sanded and polished until the old wood glowed with a warm, honeyed light. The house was transformed from a skeletal ruin into a stunning, beautiful home, solid and safe. A perfect marriage of old-world genius and modern comfort. Standing on the new porch, looking out at the woods, Leo saw not a symbol of his failure, but a monument to his survival, a testament to the idea that even the most broken things could be made whole and beautiful again. His own body began to heal in tandem with the house. With access to the best doctors and physical therapists, the constant, debilitating pain in his leg, which had been his cruelest companion for years, began to recede. The sharp, stabbing agony faded to a dull throb. And then, one morning, it was simply gone. He woke up, stood, and took a step without the familiar, sickening jolt of pain. He walked across his bedroom, his steps even and strong, and the sheer, forgotten joy of painless movement brought hot, grateful tears to his eyes. He was no longer the man with the gimpy leg that Thompson had mocked. He was just Leo. The physical healing was a reflection of a deeper, spiritual one. The weight of failure and inadequacy had been lifted, replaced by a quiet confidence and a sense of profound purpose. He was no longer a broken man in a broken house. He was a whole man in a home filled with light and hope. One cold winter afternoon, thick, silent snowflakes drifted down outside the perfectly paned windows of the restored house. A warm fire crackled in the great stone fireplace, the flames casting a dancing, golden glow on the polished wood floors. The air in the house was warm and smelled of cinnamon and baking bread. In the center of the main room, at a large, solid oak table, Maya sat drawing. Her face was a mask of concentration. A rainbow of professional-grade colored pencils spread out before her. She was no longer a frightened child huddled on a dusty floor. She was a happy, secure little girl in a warm, safe home. Leo watched her from an armchair, a book resting unread in his lap, a mug of hot chocolate steaming in his hands. He was no longer a man paralyzed by despair, counting his last few dollars. He was a father, at peace. His world no longer a terrifying void, but a sanctuary of his own making, a future bright with promise. In the clean, well-lit workshop he had built in the cellar, Leo showed Maya the heart of the house. Behind protective glass panels, the intricate, beautiful clockwork mechanisms were now visible, a gleaming web of brass gears, polished levers, and counterweights. He was teaching her how to oil a specific joint, passing on the legacy of care just as Samuel had passed the legacy of guardianship to him. He was a very smart, very sad man, Leo explained softly, and he built all of this to protect his home, and it protected us, too. The house, a machine born of grief and memory, had become a cradle of hope. Klaus Richter, the ghost in the walls, had saved them, proving that even from the deepest darkness, a legacy of light can endure. The story of Leo and Maya is a powerful reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. If you were moved by their journey from despair to redemption, subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove hope is the most powerful force of all.